Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Many of you, I'm sure, remember Farrah Fazal. She was a member of the Five on Your Side news team until she moved on in 2016. Among the places she's moved on to are Syria, Somalia, Pakistan, parts of the world that are among its most dangerous. I'm happy to welcome Farrah Fazal to our studio. So nice to see you.
Hi, Don. So good to see you.
Welcome home, I guess, in a sense.
You know, you never really... So it's really interesting because I cannot tell you that I went to high school here, but I can tell you that I never really leave here. There's this intense need that I have to keep coming back somehow to St. Louis.
Well, it's great to see you, but you've been all over the place since
I
leaving in Minneapolis for 3 years, close to 3 years,
right,
I guess.
Yeah.
And what in the world are you doing in the other parts of the world?
So, you know, earlier this year, I really felt a calling to go do some work in Syria and Lebanon.
Freelance work.
And I'd been filing for many of the European communities and the networks. And I realized that as the war kept going, and, you know, it has been going for 7 years. If you think about it, Don, an 8-year-old child in Syria has never known a life without double-barrel bombs, has never known a life without chemical attacks, has never known freedom, has never known an ability just to walk down the street without violence. So it touched me that there were not enough of us there. And so I decided actually to embed with the Syrian American Medical Society. These are doctors and nurses and therapists. And for the first time, actually, they took a mental health therapist with them. And they went to the war zone, 2 miles from the Syrian border, to the Bekaa Valley. And so the Bekaa Valley is this extensive, very rural area. But this is where many of the Syrians tried to escape the war to. And you know, the interesting part is that many of the people who escape there are not really escaping because they've gone from one war almost literally to another. The Lebanese don't recognize the Syrians, so they're not allowed to work. They are not allowed health care. There's no infrastructure from the United Nations. So they live in these settlements, if you will, these shanty towns surrounded by sewage, and many of them are children.
The conditions, we've seen pictures, obviously, and they're just astonishingly abominable.
And you know, I think what to me was so touching is that 70 to 80% of the people that I met were children, and children who were completely traumatized. On my first day there in the Bekaa Valley, the doctors had set up this sort of makeshift office, if you will, and one of the first people to walk in were 2 parents with a baby. Baby Azam couldn't breathe. He was 9 months old. And they said to the doctors, please help us. The doctors had 4 walls and no oxygen. I mean, they were just trying to help in some way. Ultimately, they said, you have to take him to the hospital. I mean, he's going to die if you don't do that. They said, we're Syrians. We can't get into the hospital. They don't help us. One of the Syrian community members who were helping these doctors drove these parents and baby Azam to the hospital. The hospital said, you cannot pay, you're Syrians, and you cannot get care here. And so they have a baby who's probably hours away from dying, and were turned back. Ultimately, the Syrian American Medical Society paid the bill. Well,
people like you, and there are a few Western correspondents there, are telling the story, but the world is not responding. I mean, the world is really kind of turning its back on what's going on in Syria to a very large degree.
I'd love to hear from your listeners about why that is. My sense is this. You may remember Marie Colvin. Marie Colvin was...
A documentary on Maria is going to be aired this weekend, I believe, on HBO or Showtime.
Right,
yeah.
It's called A Private War. Marie was one of the conflict journalists like me who really believed that regardless of whether you wanted to hear it or not, that some of us had to go bear witness and some of us had to keep telling the story. Ultimately, it has been my experience, both as a journalist and as a human being, and people who I have communicated with along the way, have told me that we don't feel connected. We don't feel connected to these people who are 10,000 miles away from us. That's a job that is incumbent upon me to help you care, to help you understand why that 8-year-old kid matters, why you should care about the million people who are suffering in the Bekaa Valley, why you should care that 500,000 people died in the last several months in a war that has been going on for 7 years. So, by telling those personal stories, and that's how we connect, right? You connect with me because you can look me in the eye and say, well, I get that you care, so maybe I can understand from your perspective why you care. And I think ultimately when we can help people tell stories, personal stories of who these people are, that they're not this big glob of people who just sort of, don't want to be home, they just want to escape. They are people who actually really care about Americans.
But, they're being universally rejected when they flee the country and cross the Mediterranean and try to get into various countries in Europe. Basically, the gate is being slammed shut.
And nobody wants them. And, Don, this is what I heard over and over again. They kept telling me that they were forgotten people. And this is not – remember who these people are. They have survived, many of them, the most brutal of regimes. The Syrian government does not have a very good record of human rights. So, when you hear, for example, I met a man who was a teacher in the Bekaa Valley, and he became a teacher. That wasn't his training. He used to be a doctor, but when he escaped to the Bekaa Valley, they realized they had all these Syrian children who were not allowed to go to Lebanese schools, and what were they going to do with them? So he decided to start teaching them, and he spoke really good English. And he said to me, I want you to know that I am somebody who really understands what freedom is like, even in this small, little, tiny place where we have no freedom. This is my freedom because I was in a torture chamber. When the Syrian government kidnapped me, they shocked my genitals. They beat me. I wasn't going to live. So the fact that I am living, that I've escaped, is a big deal, and so this is freedom. So when you hear stories of what these people have been, I talked to many people who survived chemical weapons attacks, mothers, and many of the people that I met, Don, were mothers and children because they were able to escape. Their husbands and their partners were either disappeared, or in torture chambers, or dead. I remember a guy who said to me, he brought in his child to this little makeshift center that the doctors had. And when I asked him his name, he said, I cannot tell you my name, but can I tell you my story? And he said that he was a taxi driver in Syria, in Damascus, and he was driving one day. Men in uniform stopped him. They took him to a place where he doesn't know where it was. It was a building. It was dark. And they put him in there. He remembers hearing people screaming and yelling. And then they came to him and said, your kidney is not good. And he remembers them taking him somewhere and taking out his kidney.
Okay.
And then throwing him on the side of the road. So these were the stories that we heard every day. And these are not even the most graphic of the stories that I'm telling you.
How do you get in there? How do you embed yourself with any kind of an organization in there? You just don't hop on a bus and drive into Syria and say, here I am, I want to start talking to people.
It is exceedingly difficult to get into Syria. and it is extremely dangerous to get into Syria. And so I had to have sources. I had to have people who I could trust and who wanted to trust me. The white helmets are hugely important in that area and really do help.
And they are, for those who don't know?
So the white helmets are really basically a humanitarian organization. They live in communities in Syria, and so when there are bombs that are dropping, it's the white helmets who are the first responders who try to dig people out of rubble, who try to save babies. And more often than not, they are the people who also get killed. And if you remember a few months back, the Russian government doesn't like the white helmets very much, so they launched a campaign to decertify them and make them less credible. But ultimately, these are men and women from these communities who care about their communities and want to. So the white helmets are one resource, but truly you have to rely on people on the ground. You have to make the contacts, and that's ultimately how I got in. I was on the ground on April 14th, and you may remember what April 14th was of this year. The president ordered the airstrike in Damascus, and above where we were airplanes circling. Had that escalated, we would have been ground zero. Yeah. We were 2 miles from the Syrian border. So, it's difficult to get in, but ultimately there are people who want to help people like us tell stories. And so they put their lives at risk so that we can get in.
How about getting out?
It's just as difficult. And so how you get in is how you get out. And that's why I don't really talk about how I get in there, because there are journalists who are actually right now using the same routes.
You don't want to expose the route, yeah.
Yeah, and actually those journalists, once you get in there, Don, you're not safe. I mean, the Syrian government tracks us. They know our social media pages. They know how we communicate. So we are tracked from the moment that we get in there. Now, look, I was very lucky. I was able, before I left, I met with some generals who were good sources of mine, who helped me prepare, if you will, for a war zone, who said to me, well, here's, Action 101. You're going to figure this out, and we need you to stay alive. So this is what you're going to do.
Were they protecting you?
They were actually sources in the U.S. Who knew where I was because I stayed in contact. But actually, they really ultimately couldn't protect me. There's not this web that we go in with that we're protected. We take the chance to be able to tell the story. So it's not you have to understand that when you go in, you do that at a great risk.
Are you going back?
It's a great question. I don't know yet. I think the thing that people might not understand as much is that we tell you the stories that we hope that you want to hear and that you need to hear, but those stories take a toll on us too.
Yeah.
And I carry those stories with me. There are many stories sitting in my phone that I haven't been able to tell yet.
Sitting in your phone. What a different day this is in terms of gathering information.
And from the time that you used to be in Somalia, right, in 1992, it was certainly not sitting in your phone. It was in your notebook.
No, that's right, exactly right. And that was 25 years ago, I guess. Let's talk a little bit about Somalia, because you spent some time there. You're with KTSP, a television in Minneapolis. Very large Somali community there.
Huge, yes. 100,000 people in Minnesota.
100,000, largest community, obviously, in the country. And that was the reason, I guess, through that television station that you went to Somalia. Tell me about that.
We made a proposal to the station, and I will have to tell you that this is absolutely, to the station's credit, KSTP-TV in Minneapolis. Many local stations would not just let you go to Somalia to tell stories of the communities that they serve. But our managers and my managers were committed. What we knew is that because so many people who lived in Minnesota had family in the refugee camps in Kenya and Somalia, 1 out of 5 of them had family. there. And so we were able to make the case that this was a local story for us. They were families. And I actually went to find a toddler, a 3-year-old girl. Her mother had to leave her behind when she got refugee status. And by the way, only 1%, less than 1% of all refugees will get refugee status somewhere. So she gets refugee status. She has 2 sick children, and they tell her, you can go to America, but you cannot take your baby with you because the baby is not vetted yet. The baby cannot answer questions, and so you cannot take the baby. So she has to make a decision. Do I stay in this hellhole, this refugee camp where food and water and safety are not possible, or do I go? She decided to go, and she left the baby with her parents. So 3 years later, I now meet her, and she tells me she has this baby in the refugee camp. So I went to find the baby who was 3 years old. Her name was Anfa. It was at the time when the president signed the first refugee ban, the travel ban. So we were able to see, while you were experiencing it here, the machinations of the travel ban, we were able to see what was going on the ground in the refugee camps, at the consulates, at the embassies, at the airports. We found Anfa. Wow. It's not like, you go to... it's not like King's Highway in Chippewa, there are no real
There's not a phone book.
When
you look up the name
in a refugee camp. You can actually find people. But we found her, and when I found her, I had taken some video with me of her mother saying, I had said to her mother, give me a message, you want me to take something to your daughter. And she had recorded a message, and I recorded it on my phone, and she'd said, Anfa, don't worry, Anfa. We're going to come and find you. You're going to bring you. Don't worry. It's going to be okay. So Anfa is looking at this video of her mother talking to her. And, you have had this moment, Don, perhaps as a journalist. There is a moment where that intersects completely with your humanity. Mm-hmm. And as Anfa is looking at this phone and her mother's voice, she bends down and she kisses my phone.
Oh, wow.
She misses her mother.
I would think, yeah.
So you can sleep at night. I want to tell you that it took 7 months. When we came back, we went to the area where the mom lived, and we talked to the congressman. And ultimately, 7 months later, to the day that we last met her, she came to America.
Oh, wow. What a dramatic story. Is there any place people can find these stories that you've been filing? Or do you
Absolutely.
Have posted online, for instance?
I do. I have all of my, digital journalism has become extremely important in war zones. Mm-hmm. So you can find all of my platforms, and I'm posting there constantly, and I'll leave that with you.
Good.
I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram.
We'll put
really
links
everywhere.
on our website at stlpublicradio.org. But back to Somalia. Somalia is a failed state, and it has been for a long time. That's another hot spot for you. Again, navigating these refugee camps and just society in general has to be extraordinarily difficult.
At that particular time when we went 2 years ago now, it was Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization, had been extremely active. So as I was interviewing a minister from the government, there were bombs going off outside of his house. It was extremely difficult to get around. There were barricades everywhere. There were soldiers everywhere. We were being followed everywhere. And I remember our station had allowed us to hire security, Kenyan and Somali soldiers, to be able to protect us.
And they can't always be trusted.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. So we had to keep moving every 20 minutes. And they said to us, and I remember saying, I just need to record this one little stand-up. And they said, yeah, no, you cannot do anything. You need to move now. It was difficult to operate and do, work in that environment, but yet we were able to actually meet people who were at the height of famine. This was at the height of the famine 2 years ago. There were people starving to death. We saw children starving to death. And you know what that's like, having been there in 92.
I covered famine there back in 92. We only have a minute left. You've talked to some of these young people from Minneapolis who went to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab. Very quickly, can you give me some sense of what their motivation was to do that?
Two big things. One was that when children who are born here of Somali parents feel the need to fit in, and so they're different when they go to high school. They speak a little differently than when they speak at home, and ultimately they don't feel that they belong anywhere. And Al-Shabaab creates the opportunity for a brotherhood to belong somewhere, and that's the key in.
How do they get there? I mean, it costs money to get that part of the world.
It's interesting how Al-Shabaab and ISIS recruit people because they fly you there. They give you money. They make it easy for you to go, and this is why we should care, because ISIS is constantly recruiting in the United States in your community.
What's next for Farrah Fazal?
It has always been the North Star to tell stories, untold stories of people who are forgotten, and it always will be.
Yeah. Well, it's so great to see you again. Congratulations on some great reporting. I mean, very, very dramatic stuff, and we'll put that link to your sources online on our website at STOpublicradio.org.
Thank you for having me.
So folks can track you and follow you and stalk you online.
I'd love it.
Farrah Fazal, thank you once again.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.